Zo, het is voor mij een bijzonder genoegen om mijn collega, islamoloog, Koran-specialist en ook een vriend te kunnen inleiden. We hebben elkaar leren kennen een paar jaar geleden. Ik heb even nagedacht, dat is 2018, dat is nog niet zo lang geleden, bij gelegenheid van de Orientalistendagen die in Antwerpen georganiseerd waren. Ja, het is altijd een wisselende plek. En toen was het thema dat er opgegeven was, de zee, la mer, de zee. En daar heeft Decharnieux een lezing gegeven, de eerste keer dat ik hem hoorde spreken over dat onderwerp in verband met de Koran. En iets is mij daarbij bijgebleven, dat het wereldbeeld dat we daar zien ontwikkeld worden, het wereldbeeld is dat niets te maken heeft met de woestijn, nog met de nomaden, maar een ander wereldbeeld dat ergens anders thuis hoort. En over dit onderwerp hopen wij binnen 2 jaar dat het daarbij aansluit het wereldbeeld van de Koran en de achtergronden van de Koran. In 2024 denk ik een colloquium te organiseren dat hier aan de UOB en ook in Parijs aan 3 verschillende locaties zal moeten gebeuren over de bronnen van de Koran in de Oost-Syrische christelijke wereld en ook de Joodse wereld. Dat is een project dat wij daar al een tijdje lang koesteren. Binnenkort zien wij hier elkaar ook nog weer. Ik kondig dat maar al even aan voor degenen die het nog niet weten, bij een van de Orientalistendagen, dagen de Belgische Orientalisten, die hier gaan georganiseerd worden einde maart, 24, 25 maart, misschien ook 23, maar dat weten we nog niet, dat er op een dagje bij zal komen. En die wij met het bestuur organiseren. Daarbij moet ik nu even vertellen dat in die korte tijd eigenlijk Decharnieux zich heeft internationaal geprofileerd als een specialist van de Koran en van de bronnen van de Koran, de achtergronden van de Koran, vooral vanuit bronnen van spirituele literatuur van het Oosten. En dat is al tot uiting gekomen in zijn commentaar dat hij geschreven heeft, stukken van het commentaar in de fameuze Roman des Historiens, en meer bepaald in zijn geval over de Soera 12, dat de enige Soera is van de Koran die aan éénzelfde Bijbels thema is gewijd, namelijk Jozef in Egypte. Het is de enige Soera die zo een geheel vormt. En die toch wel een heel moeilijke Soera om te commentariëren, dat het commentaar is van zijn hand. Wat hij vandaag over vrijheid en de islam gaat vertellen, dat weet ik absoluut niet. Dat ga ik nu samen met u aan ontwikkelen. Alsjeblieft, simpelweg, please.
First of all, I want to thank again Dean for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here and to be able to present on a topic that I've never really had the occasion to focus so much on in the past, even though some things that I will present today are connected to my doctoral dissertation. So maybe before starting really talking about freedom in Islam, freedom and Islam, I need to make a few linguistic apologies. I'm meant to know Flemish and to express myself in this language, but I'm not able to. And I must admit also that it's been a long time since I presented anything in English. So if something is not clear, please just ask. So I was asked to talk about the topic of freedom in Islam. It is a very difficult topic. I had, as I'm not myself a specialist of modern Islam, I had the choice of either talking to you about theological debates in Muslim medieval discussions on the notion of freedom or free will. But sometimes those debates are really intricated, they're very complex, and then it's not so fun to it's fun to study, but it's not so easy to explain it properly in front of a lay audience, let's say. And so I chose to talk about the notion of free will in the Quran, which is a bit paradoxical because there are no notion of free will in the Quran. Actually, the Quran does not conceptualize notions such as freedom, free will, or even their antonyms like predestination is not theorized either. It does not mean that the Quran does not say anything about predestination or the freedom of people, the freedom of human beings in the world, but it does not conceptualize these topics, these themes, concepts. The reason why it doesn't conceptualize them is basically correlated with the very nature of the text. The Quran, for those of you who maybe once opened it, is a very odd text, at least as compared to the Bible. It is very difficult to read in the first place when you don't have the appropriate prism or appropriate lens through which reading it. It is a very allusive text as compared to the Bible. For example, there are almost no narratives. So Jan mentioned Surah 12, which I commented in the previous chapter of Quran Historien. Surah 12 is an exception in the Quran. It's a narrative of Joseph, patriarch Joseph in the Bible. It's about 100 verses, but it's a unique case. Otherwise, the Quran remains very allusive. There are no narrations, only allusions to stories previously known, which tells us something about the audience to which the Quran is addressed. Even though modern research shows connections with Christian writings, this text, and especially Christian theological writings, that today scholars agree that the Quran drew a lot of material from homiletical literature from the late antiquity, especially Syriac writings of late antiquity. The text doesn't borrow really systematic theological thought from this literature. What is this text talking about? Well, basically, this text is an exhortation. The Quran addresses the audience and exhorts it to adhere to a very simple monotheistic message. The core theological message of the text is basically that God is one, that he has no associates, otherwise that would mean, in its mind, that would mean that God partakes his divinity with other beings. He has no associates, and that's basically it. The Quran keeps repeating to its audience this unique message. So it's not surprising in a sense not to find the notion of freedom in the Quran. Of course, the text sometimes speaks of the idea of freeing slaves. It's not really connected to our topic, but it's worth mentioning. And the notion of tahrir, freeing of slaves, is mentioned as a compensation for different misconducts among believers in at least 3 cases. But in the sense of free will, which is the topic of today's talk, the text does not use the notion of freedom. The question I'm going to try to answer is, does the Quran regard human beings as free in their thoughts and in their acts? Or, on the contrary, does the text understand human beings as constrained or in any sort of way? Are they auto-determined or are they predetermined by God? Are they, and if they are determined by God, in what manner? I'm afraid to say that the Quran has no clear-cut answer to that topic. And this is why it is a very tricky question, because there are passages of the Quran which seem to endorse the idea that humans are free in their daily activities are free to believe, are free to choose not to believe. But there are also passages that seems to imply that human beings are predetermined by God from all eternity, that everything was written well in advance by God, that the activities of human beings are completely dominated or ruled by God. We know very little of the context, the social cultural context in which the Quran emerges in the beginning of the 7th century. We know from the Muslim tradition that, according to the Muslim tradition, the Quran is supposed to be born in a western part of Arabia, in, of course, first Mecca and then Medina. The Muslim traditional accounts of the emergence of Islam tell us that, at least in Mecca, Medina as well, but in Mecca it is predominant. There are a huge population of polytheists, and that one of the beliefs of these polytheists is common to all Arabia, is the belief in the idea of dahr, which is basically the idea of fate. It's comparable to the fortuna of the Latins. This idea is connected to the activity of the gods. The gods sort of determine the fate of human beings, but it's all often, at least in pre-Islamic poetry, which we have a large corpus of, it's very often personified. It's a power that acts on its own. It is some sort of a force that is associated to the individual's life. The dahr determines, for example, the time of the death of someone, or good or bad fortune happening to anyone. It is interesting that the Quran takes issue with this notion of dahr. In one passage, the Quran says the following thing: but they say, polytheists, there is nothing but our present life. We die and we live, and nothing destroys us but time. It's translated time here. The word is dahr in Arabic. They have no knowledge about that. They only conjecture. So you see here the Quran attacking it in a very classical Quranic way, I'd say. The pre-Islamic or allegedly pre-Islamic belief in the idea of fate, that the life of human beings are ruled by sort of invisible power. It is not surprising that the Quran is attacking this notion, this belief. Why? Because one of the main themes of the Quran is, of course, the idea that the end of times, the day of judgment, will very soon come. The Quran keeps repeating to its audience that the hour, as it says, is near, and that they need to behave in a proper manner if they want to be judged the right way. The theme of divine justice is illustrated in the Quran in a various way. Very often we find the idea of the scale of justice, for example. Interesting for our topic is the name given to the day of judgment. There are various names given to the eschaton. One of them is Yawm al-Hisab, that is the day of the account, let's translate, the day when everyone will have to pay its debts towards God. So you see that in a context where you believe that you need to behave properly if you want to be judged and in a good way, the notion that there is that people are predetermined, the idea that people that some sort of power rules the life of human beings and that they are not responsible for their actions, it does not fit. So it's not surprising that the Quran is attacking this pre-Islamic belief here. Another interesting image used by the Quran to mention that human beings will be judged according to what they did is the notion of a sort of book of deeds. The Quran seems to hold the idea that angels are assigned to every human as a child, and that the angel writes down everything that one thinks or does. It is very well illustrated in these two passages, which I'm going to read. And every human, we have fastened his fate on him, to him on his neck. And he shall bring forth, and we shall, sorry, there is a mistake. And we shall bring forth the book for him on the day of resurrection, which he will find unrolled. Read your book, you are sufficient today as a reckoner against yourself. A similar passage. To God belongs the kingdom of the heavens and the earth. On the day when the hour strikes, on that day the perpetrators of falsehood will lose. You will see each community kneeling, each community called to its book. Today you will be repaid for what you have done. So here it's pretty clear that everyone will have as a reward according to what they did in this world life. So the image of the book of deeds, which maybe not the right way to call it, is of course an idea that is found in the Bible already. We found it in that Daniel, in the Psalms, in Luke as well. It is a very common idea among biblical tradition. So you see that the notion of divine justice is very present in this text, and that it is at odds with the idea that your life or your activities are predetermined by some sort of force. Why? Because how can an absolutely good God punish you for something you're not responsible for? It's very easy to understand how both notions are antithetic. There are several passages I could quote here. I just want to quote a further example, which really shows that the notion of righteousness in the behavior in this worldly life is important, and that even evil actions are the fruit, are the responsibility of the one, is the responsibility of the one who does it. It's Surah 45. Whoever does righteousness, it is for himself. And whoever does evil, it is likewise against himself. Then, O Lord, you will be returned. This is a common expression, this last bit, it's a common expression to mention that, of course, you will be brought in front of the Lord on the day of resurrection and judged accordingly. It is striking, given what we say, that there are several passages in the text, and actually most passages talking about predestination or free will. There are several of them which defend the idea that human beings are predetermined by God, that defend the idea of predestination. These passages, they come from a different angle. We've said that the notion of, the idea that humans are responsible for their activity, for their deeds in this world, comes from the Quranic development on the notion of divine justice. But now there are other passages which try to defend the idea that God is one and unique, and that nothing is associated to him, and that he is omniscient and omnipotent. The text repeatedly affirms that God, that nothing can escape God's will, God's science. It is said in a very formulaic manner that God is Qadir ala kul shay, that he is powerful over everything. it's quite striking to find in the text passage that suggests that God is responsible for the belief or the unbelief of its people, of its creatures. I quote here a passage of Surah 74. By no means, surely, it is a reminder. The reminder is the Quran. And whoever pleases takes heed of it. But they will not take heed unless God pleases. He is worthy of guarding oneself against and worthy of dispensing forgiveness. So there seems to be here the idea that, okay, you can choose to believe, but if God does not want you to believe, you won't be able to do so. The question, of course, is to what extent and in what way does God determine one's life? Is God continually playing with human beings as, I don't know, a kid playing with toy soldiers, for example? Or is there some sort of predestination involved here that is something that is planned well in advance? The Quran clearly leans towards the idea that God that God wrote a plan for creation before creation, and that this that creation is just the unfolding of His plan. That everything was set before creation. We have a passage where Abraham is depicted as addressing idol worshippers, and he says to them, "Do you serve what you care, whereas God created you and what you make?" It is interesting here that God did not only create human beings, He created their acts as well, the text seems to imply. The word وَمَا تَعْمَلُونَ in Arabic is pretty explicit here. So God seems to plan and to plan everything that happens in the world. Especially this image is conveyed by means of very recurring motif in the Quran, which is the book of creation. I mean, the Quran does not use the expression book of creation. It refers to the book Al-Kitab in Arabic, but it's recurring in the text. Here, for example, in Surah 27, but you see there are many parallels. There is nothing hidden in the sky or on the earth, except that it is recorded in a clear book. So everything is recorded in a clear book, and we know that the Quran also defends in one passage, so seems to defend the idea that there exists sort of celestial books, a book next to God in heaven, and that this book contains everything that is, the knowledge of the entire universe, let's say. There are also parallel to this motif of the heavenly book or the book of creation in the Bible. There is a passage in the Psalms, but again, there are many parallel passages that explicitly refer to this image. Thy eyes beheld my unformed substance. In thy book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. So God wrote everything well in advance here. The Quran seems only to reuse to refer to a well-known biblical motif. So the idea that men and women and everything they do is created by God, is the responsibility of God, this becomes problematic when we deal with the question of theodicy, of course, the question of the origin of evil in the world. Why? Because if God created everything in the world, and including human deeds, did He also will evil deeds? Did He also will evil in the world? I mean, this is very odd, but the Quran seems not to resist the temptation to affirm that God knows everything and that nothing escapes His will, to the extent that he's also, in a way, responsible for evil in the world. There are numerous passages that could be quoted here, but I quote here a passage from Surah 10, which is very intriguing. If your Lord had so pleased, whoever was on the earth would indeed have believed, all of them together. Will you compel the people until they become believers? It is not for any person to believe except by the permission of God. This is abomination on those who do not understand. So it is very odd. I mean, we don't expect that from an absolutely good God to will, to want unbelief happening in the world. If he is omnipotent, we expect him to have only believers. But it's not the case. He apparently also foreplanned unbelief in creation. It is therefore striking, if we go back to the passage where the Quran rejects the idea of the pre-Islamic idea of dahr, of fate. It is striking to see that it sort of rejects it, but keeps supporting this idea. There is a fate in the world. There is something that is written, that is planned. There is some sort of force that is responsible for everyone's action. But this force is God himself. So no sort of invisible power disconnected to the gods. No, fate is God. And it is interesting that in a later tradition, we have a hadith, so a prophetical saying attributed to Muhammad that seems very early. That is okay. So it's called a hadith Qudsi. It's a holy hadith. It's a word of God, but that is not the Quran. It's a bit odd. That has Allah say, "I am the Dahr," which is interesting. There is some sort of merging. The Dahr cannot be a force disconnected to God. God is the Dahr. God is destiny. God is fate. So basically, when we're interested in the question of freedom or predestination in the Quran, well, you are facing this paradox. Several passages support that everything is determined by God well in advance before creation. And several other passages seem to defend the idea that everyone is responsible for the deeds and that everyone will be judged accordingly. How are we as philologists to resolve this paradox? Well, of course, one thing the easy answer would be to say, well, there must have remained in the Quranic community around Muhammad, let's say, people that were not ready to give up this notion of fate ruling everybody. That would be the easy answer. So a pre-Islamic belief that keeps that the Quran absorbs and reframes. Another answer would be, of course, to read the Quran as the Muslim tradition has it, and to think that maybe at some point in the prophetic career of Muhammad, he was inclined to defend the idea of predetermination, and that later on, maybe, he was more inclined to stress the notion of divine judgment, and that therefore he changed his mind. This is also possible because, of course, you know that the Quran is meant to be revealed to Muhammad over the span of 2 decades, more than 2 decades. So Muslim traditionists have pointed out very early on that there is an evolution in the Quranic theological message, in the way of phrasing things, etc. It's not impossible that he changed his mind. But the problem is that everything we know about the life of Muhammad and And the traditional account of the emergence of the Quran is based basically on the sources of the Muslim tradition, which are meant to be transmitted orally for more than 1 century and a half until the end of the 8th century, where it was written down. But nowadays, scholars show that it is not to say that these sources are completely unreliable, but at least to some extent, it is possible to raise some doubt about their historicity. Lots of passages of these sources, which are, I mean, it is a huge corpus, are anachronical, are legendary, are apologetic, they are very problematic from the historical point of view. What scholars show, however, these days is that it is very much possible that the Quran was written in over a much longer period of time, probably not, I mean, in its final form, the Quran does not appear probably before the second half of the 7th century, not to say the end of the 7th century, that scholars can more or less well show that the Quran is probably not the fruit of a single author. Perhaps Muhammad is responsible for a very ancient parts of the text, but it is clear that the text was reframed, rewritten, edited, transformed over time, and that these transformations were made by scribes that were not, I mean, it's uneven. Their theological agenda may have been different. Their theological background may have been different. They were maybe not all as well theologically equipped, as I like to say. So it is not impossible that here we have the traces with regard to the question of freedom of predestination of different tendencies among the compilers of the Quran itself. This paradox would be solved here. We would assume that different layers of the text would have argued different things with that regard. But, I mean, of course, we should not try to harmonize the text. We should not try to resolve this paradox, and we need to embrace it. But I'm wondering, and this is part of my doctoral dissertation, whether the text does not bear the traces of a more complex system that has been understudied by scholars to this day. It is strange in the passages, assuming that presupposes predestination, that the text does not encourage and even discourage a fatalistic attitude towards life. I mean, when everything is predetermined, you would think that, I mean, no matter what you do, God already knows whether you go to hell or paradise, so why do anything in the world? Why even praying, etc. But the Quran actually attacks this behavior and rejects it. And it is a passage of Surah 17. They were saying, do we have any part at all in the affair? So it's a passage that talks about a battle, what happened in a battle. They were saying, do we have any part at all in the affair? Say, surely the affair, all of it, belongs to God. God is responsible for it. They hide within themselves what they do not reveal to you. They were saying, if we had any part in the affair, we would not have been killed here. Say, even if you had been in your houses, those for whom death was written would still indeed have gone forth to the places where they lie dead. That happened in order that God might test you, might test what was in your hearts, and that he might purge what was in your hearts. God knows what's in your heart, what's in your heart. So as I said, it is interesting to note here that the text affirms that God chooses everything and wrote the outcome of the battle in advance, but at the same time says that this should not lead to people staying in their houses, as it says. It should not lead to a fatalistic attitude. One shouldn't stay in his house because God set everything in order to test, because God set everything in order to test everyone's heart, as the text says. What does that mean? Well, one has to remember here that the heart among ancient people, it is true, especially in a Semitic thought, the heart is the seat of the intellect. So basically, this is where your capacity to choose between doing good things or bad things is. That is where your intellect is located in your heart. The text here affirms that God set everything to test people, even though everything is already set. In my doctoral dissertation, I tried to show that the Quran develops the idea that this world, I mean, the telos of this world, its reason for existing, is precisely to test people, their intellect, to see whether they're worthy of being saved or not. And the text seems to develop a very complex system, a contemplative system, as I call it, where God lends his grace to everyone, sort of. The Quran uses the notion, I mean, the idea of descent. God descends towards people. And it is the people's responsibility to sort of contemplate creation, contemplate scripture, contemplate revelation, and try to find God themselves. So it's an encounter rather than a quest, if you like. And how is this encounter happening? Well, it's happening after a long process of purification. Several passages of the text seem to imply that through continuous practice, pietistic attitudes such as praying all the time, remembering God all the time, reciting the Quran all the time, you sort of purify yourself. And by self, I mean your heart. And you're slowly able to captate sort of the divine grace and to be guided rightfully by God. So as I said, it's a complex system which has been understudied, and it is very much connected to spiritual, especially Christian, Eastern Christian spiritual traditions of late antiquity. And I hope to be able to study that more deeply in future research. So that's basically it for the Quran, a very paradoxical text. Now I want to conclude in saying a few words about what happened in the later tradition. Well, you saw that from the Quranic text itself, there was room for, I mean, two tendencies to emerge in the early theological debates about freedom and free will. What the text talks about is that the Quran says that the major events of individuals are ruled by God, but never say anything about, I'd say, the trivialities of life, such as eating, fasting, sleeping. Is it God who makes someone eat, fast, sleep, breathe, etc.? Or is it something that human beings are responsible to? Well, the Quran does not answer that question. But for Muslim people, at least Sunni Muslims, there is another corpus of literature which is important, which is called the Sunnah, which is the prophetic tradition. And we will find in this corpus, in this body of literature, answers to those questions. It is interesting that in this corpus, as I said earlier, which is later than the Quran, the corpus of the Sunnah emerges at the end of the 9th century, but still at this time the text seems to conserve polemics against the idea of fate. It's still polemicized against people holding this idea, which seems to suggest that this belief was still very much alive by the 8th century. Of the 6 canonical collections of prophetical sayings of the Hadith, 4 have chapters on what they call the Qadar, which is basically the notion of free will. It's striking that none of these very numerous sayings defend the idea of free will for human beings. They all seem to to be in favor of the predetermined predestinationist position. This probably is explainable by means of, by looking at who wrote down these hadiths. They were very orthodox very orthodox theologians that defended this position. But as we learn from the Muslim sources themselves, it seems that debates about free will among human beings emerged as early as the 8th century. And the sources say that there were basically 2 positions, 2 sort of group of theologians facing each other. On the one hand, we had traditionalists, called in the literature Jabarites, who thought that God determines everything, basically everything from from the most trivial action to the most important. And against them, they had another group called the Qadarites, which held that children were absolutely free. It seems that the debate continued well into the 8th and 9th century, because later on we find, and they're much more documented, a school of theology called the Mu'tazila, that is very much influenced by Greek rationalism, and that defends the idea that humans are absolutely free. They had their moment of glory. They became state doctrine in the 9th century, beginning of the 9th century. But they were backed by important political figures, but at some point they fell into the Caliph was against them, and they were killed, and they fell into dismay, sort of. Against them were the so-called Ash'arites, who believed in predestination, absolute predestination. Of course, they enter into very, very complex debates, and they try to, of course, articulate the idea that people are still responsible for their deeds, with the idea that God foreplanned everything in advance. It is a debate in which I will not enter, but it is interesting that of these 2 schools, only the latter survive, and today, basically in Sunni Islam, I know very little of Shiism. It is the predestinationist party that still exists. Okay, so thank you very much. I hope it wasn't too painful, and I'll wait for questions. Thank you.
debate is open. Should we start with the public there online? I don't know.
Are there any questions online?
Let's see someone. No, that is.
Okay, I will start. Thank you very much for your presentation. A lot of notes because it was very interesting.
Okay. It was also very confused as you realize. I mean, the Quran is confused about its topic, and so it makes it quite difficult to synthesize it. But it was a proof of thought.
Well, I was wondering a couple of things, but maybe the first question, maybe you can say something about the link between the Quranic worldview at the beginning, like you said, 7th, 8th, 9th century, and the view on history, on world history. I mean, at the same period, Christian tradition, Europe was forming, and they had that notion of God wants the world history. God wants Christianity to gain the whole continent. Europe was the world at that time, so it was the aim of God to let Christianity prevail. Do we have the same worldview on history in Islamic tradition, or was that another worldview? I wonder.
I mean, of course, I mean, we can't assume that there was not a desire to spread Islam as of the beginning, but it did not really work. We know that Muslims were a minority in Islam. I mean, Islam is a big eye in the civilization of Islam until the 10th century, at least in most of the in Middle East, and even in Egypt, and sometimes in other regions even later. So yes, there was a proselyte desire in the endeavor, but I mean, it took time. It was not as, I mean, suddenly the word did not get up in the beginning of the 8th century, and was certainly much more complicated than that. And we see that early in the first conquest, Arabs were forced to rely on Christians and Zoroastrians. I mean, a bureaucracy that was in place for centuries in the big empires of Byzantium and Iran.
Because what we know about the beginning, the first ages, what we know, I'm not saying it's scientifically correct, but still, that there was a lot of war, that there was a lot of fighting going on in the first decennia. So I was wondering, was that a pure economically warfare, or was it religious warfare, like they used to say and think? Was it jihadi idea?
Well, I'm not sure you can disconnect both notions. I mean, at that period of time, everything is integrated. Also, we need to be careful about the very identity, I mean, Muslim identity. That is something that, if we follow the tradition, that is something that arises, I mean, that is there from the beginning. That Muhammad preached Islam, and that was the new religion, etc. In fact, we see from the material and archaeological evidence that probably no one would describe himself as Muslim until at least the end of the 7th century. If I recall correctly what I read, it's been a while since I read about this, but we have loads of epigraphical evidence in the desert. There were writing graffiti everywhere. And no one, I mean, there they say, I am XYZ, and I am, they would use an identity marker. Nowhere until 720s, no one uses the word Muslim in Arabic to describe himself. They call themselves Mu'min, for example, which is a very complex identity marker, but they don't use Muslim as an identity marker. After that, I mean, I think from the beginning of the 8th century, we can talk of Islam. Some say that it is the Caliph Abdel Malik who is the real founder of Islam, but this is a bit provocative.
So if I understand you correctly, there was no specific notion of free will at the beginning.
No, I think it is not theorized.
Yeah.
It is not conceptualized. It does not mean that that is not there. I mean, from the passage we see clearly the text has something to say about the responsibility or not of people in the world. But also what we see is that we don't have here theologians writing new sacred texts. They clearly, I think, they say things, they don't see the consequences of it. For example, when they say that God is responsible for evil in the world, so I mean, I'm schematizing, of course, here, but when they say, for example, that God makes a pact with the devil to tempt people in the world, that he agrees for that. I mean, I don't think that they were really aware of the theological consequences of such theological arguments, but that's my personal idea. I think they come here when they argue that God even planned evil in the world. They come from, I mean, what they have in mind is to prove that nothing escapes God's will and God's omniscience and God's power. And that since he's all powerful, he's responsible for everything evil or good. That's what I think. Then after that, it seems, because the sources attest that as early as the beginning of the 8th century, so that is less than a century after the death of the prophet, already there were theologians disputing about the topic of free will. And the matter was not only religious or theological, it was also political. Because at that moment you have a dynasty called the Umayyad dynasty that is ruling, and that is very much control. I mean, their power is I mean, they have a lot of opponents, and they legitimate their power by means of predestinationist idea. They say that this is the will of God, that it was written for them to rule. And so you see how politics and religious matters are intertwined. So I think debates emerge very early, because as soon as you have a text that is authoritative, let's not use the word sacred here, you start to try to explain every bit of it. And you also, I mean, when Arabs conquered Middle Eastern territories, they entered into closer contacts with, I mean, other religious communities, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, and in these communities, there were theologians that were very, very much equipped to think about these topics. And they, I mean, Christians and Jews Christians more than Jews were thinking about the question of free will and relation to the biblical text for a century at that point. So probably under their influence, they started to pinpoint the pitfalls, I mean, in their text, or pinpoint the matters that needed to be clarified. Maybe Jan can also answer. He's a much greater specialist than I am.
Yeah, wanted to say something that I was thinking that your remarks about the presence of the idea of fate or fortune in the Quran and as related to pre-Islamic times. It's I think, a very interesting idea. And I remember that somewhere, but I don't know exactly the site anymore. It's somewhere in northern Arabia. You have this statue of such a deity. It's a female deity, as it is in the Roman world, with a zodiac above her head. And it's from Arabic origin. I think that you know what I'm talking about. So you see this presence of this concept of fortune, and in Aramaic, she or he is called God. He becomes female in the Greek and Roman world. It was a concept that was very much spread all over the Orient, and influenced perhaps somehow. And then we could ask ourselves, and this is something that is often forgotten when people are studying the thought of late antiquity, if there is not any historic influence there. But I don't know. Perhaps when I was thinking about the passages that you have been reading of the Quran, already somewhere in the Quran. But then the question arises, of course, is it coming from the time of the Prophet or some time later? That's always a difficulty. We have heard that. That is very, you explained that very clearly. And it's always important to remember that the Quran is a text that was a text in prose from the time of the Prophet.
Yes, I think this notion of Tawhid, it is interesting that the Quran rejects, attacks the belief, and then that we find a Hadith Qudsi, which they have a very strange status, these sayings. It is very odd to think that there are words of God that are not in the Quran but conserved in the later tradition. I do think that those Hadith Qudsi, at least part of them, must be early, and they must reflect some sort. And it is interesting that in the Hadith I mentioned, it is repeated in very different collections of prophetical sayings. They do not reject anymore the idea of Dar, as if this is a battle that they gave up on, because it seems that it's so much ingrained in new Muslim people that we need to do with it, and we will not say anymore that Dar does not exist. We will say that Dar is God, and it is a very common way of, a common mechanism in the history of religion to sort of not reject, for example, old gods to place new one instead, but to say that the old gods are actually subordinated to the new one, and you sort of make an ancient pantheon enter into a new one, if you like. And it's what's happening. It is what is happening with the notion of fate, of that. It's so much there that we cannot attack this notion, even though it contradicts some of our theological claims. We will just merge it with our system, and it's how this Hadith Qudsi, I think, merges. But we are not a specialist of this literature. So.
It's almost impossible to say what the Prophet might have meant by such an inferior concept, let's say, if at early times there would already be the possibility to have a kind of a hypostasis, which is of course not an Islamic idea later on. But what did they think about that in early times? It's difficult to say.
Well, the notion is used very often in pre-Islamic poetry, But of course, then we have the problem of the historical reliability of pre-Islamic poetry, which, as prophetical sayings, were transmitted for a very, very long period of time before being written down and edited and transformed. And it is very surprising, for example, to my knowledge, that we have so few references in this huge body of literature, that we have so little reference to pre-Islamic beliefs. I mean, except the notion of darkness there, but very little reference to rituals, gods, beliefs. I mean, it must have been interpolated somehow, transformed, edited.
But our references to Christianity.
Of course, yes.
Many Islamic poems in it.
Yeah, there are pre-Islamic Christian Arabic poets.
Yes. Can you reflect, if I may ask, on contemporary Islamic tradition? And yeah, I know, but it's just not purely scientifically, just to have an idea, because today is the fact that they don't have a conceptualized notion of free will, the basis today for inequality we see in a lot of Islamic countries, traditions. In fact, we see it every day today on television, but also in other parts of the world where Islamic states are in control. We have the idea that it's not equal society, that women are less than men. And I was thinking that because they don't have a conceptualization of that free will.
I think it's a whole. I think it's part of it. I'm really no expert of modern Islam, but I do think that those experts we often see on TV, etc., they tend to underestimate the theological background of the behavior of ISIS or whoever we're talking about. There is a huge body of literature that sort of legitimates and back their activity. I mean, it's there. And I think that it has huge consequences on modern Islamic thought, but not only jihadists or common Muslim people. I think it has huge consequences that they don't have a notion of free will developed as traditions, including non-religious traditions. But there are really no specialists, so I don't want to release too much.
But because in the Western culture, religious and non-religious is just like with the Renaissance, it started to be just like in the Enlightenment to the cultural surface. Before that, it was Western society, Christian society was not equal either. The Middle Ages and the ancient times.
But I think that we shouldn't also overemphasize the consequence of theological notions. I would say usually people behave in a way and then try to find the right theological discourse to legitimate their actions. It's not, I mean, it's more often like that than the other way around, I think. Maybe it's both dynamics.
So you have first the behavior and then the narrative.
The explanation, but I think that if they want to, I mean, that's a principle of interpretation. You can interpret a text, not necessarily a sacred text, any text, the way you like, depending on your reading grades. So, but I think that still it has important implications that the notion of free will was rejected in early theological debates, because basically, not sure. We need to look at later Syrian traditions, etc. I think that after the sort of disappearance of Mu'tazilism in the 10th, 9th, 10th century, of course they survived in various places in Islam, but there was no advocates for free will. Maybe we need to look at the reformist thinkers of the 19th century. You have lots of so-called reformists, Muslim reformists at that time, but I'm not sure they defend the idea of free will either. I'm actually quite sure that some of them defended the contrary. I don't know, maybe we was looking at the Indian Muhammad Iqbal. He had interesting ideas, but there again, I really don't know.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
I would say perhaps that there's of course an enormous difficulty. What we know about society in the times of the prophet, we only know it through later sources, and a little bit Muhammad is perhaps also a little bit later source. So we do not know exactly, but one has the impression that in the time of the prophet, society, at least for what the fathers of the big families is concerned, was somehow an equal society, for the Bedouins, let's say. But then it developed, the society changed dramatically very early already with the first caliphs into something that's an absolute monarchical system, and where this equality disappears totally, and it becomes a society that's completely determined. We were talking this Friday about Monsieur Sfar in his book, L'Autre Coran. It's translated in English, by the way, but I don't know the exact title. And he is showing how the texts developed into something that is proving that society should be completely a dictatorship, and that you have then freedom disappears completely.
It's also interesting that if you look at the anthropology of the Quran, the way the Quran describes the relationship between human beings and God is by means of the image of servanthood. People, and not only because when we say servants of God, we think of believers today, but actually the Quran uses the word ibad, that is servants, for all human beings, believers and unbelievers alike. And it is interesting that this text, which emerges later than we usually think, sort of presents sort of hierarchy. That describes the connection between God and its folks in these terms, because it maybe tells us something of how society was structured at that moment. I read that once, not intelligent to remark that, but I like the idea that things in heaven mirror things on earth. And it's not surprising that we describe God as a Lord and human beings as servants when you are ruled by a Lord and that you are a servant of someone. And we know that it works for other topics in the Quran. We have, this is completely out of topic, but I like to mention it. God is depicted in some passages of the Quran as a teacher. It is interesting. at least I think Jan would support me on that view, but it is probably because at that point the Christian informers of, I mean, in Syriac Christianity, Eastern Syriac Christianity, in the 5th, 6th, and 7th century, you have the development of a school movement. So you have, it's unprecedented in history. You have monks going out of schools and going on missions. And it is very probable that, that actually the authors of the Quran or the Quranic community entered into contact with people who were marked by their training, this school training. And we know that there in those schools, Christian schools, they had entire texts depicting God as a divine pedagogue, teaching to the angels before creation and then to the humans, etc. I mean, we have like this image of a divine pedagogue overemphasized, and probably the reason why the Quran reuses this image is also because, I mean, it talks, it's sort of, it's an image that talks to its audience. Again, heavenly things are mirroring what's happening on earth.
Beautiful.
This last remark was very interesting.
Okay.
It's fundamental to explain like, this will be your contribution, I think, to the study of the Quran. I forgot to mention at the beginning of in my introduction that your PhD thesis will be edited rather soon, I think.
I mean, later than I thought, but you know how it goes. Probably first semester of 2023.
The edition, the editor will be
the writer.
So it will be rather expensive to buy.
Well, I could send a copy here.
Good. I think it's all. Thank you very much again.
Yeah,
Thank you.